The first truck came up the gravel lane a little after 7 on a raw morning in the fall of 2019, engine laboring, a plume of pale dust lifting off its open bed. It did not stop at the house. It rolled past the leaning barn, swung wide at the edge of the back field, and then a hydraulic whine climbed over the diesel, and the bed tipped and let go. Tons of sawdust and pale curled shavings sliding off in a long hissing cascade, catching the low sun and hanging in the cold air like gold smoke before they settled into a mound the height of a man. The driver never got down from the cab. Before noon a second truck came, and after it a third, and by mid-afternoon 3 steaming mountains of sawdust stood along the fence line of a farm the county had given up on, the sharp smell of cut oak over the whole place. It was waste from Caldwell Hardwoods, the big mill down on the river road, the fine dust off the blades, the long shavings off the planer, the sweepings of 100,000 board feet of oak and poplar and maple. For years the mill had sold it off for bedding and pellets. But the pellet plant had closed that winter. New air rules had made burning it a fined offense, and the landfill charged by the ton. Years back, the mill had struck a handshake with the old man who farmed this place, dumped the shavings on his back field, bed his cattle for free, save everybody the hauling. The old man had been 3 years in the ground, his cattle long since sold, and no one had thought to ask whether it still held. Cars slowed on the county road to look at the pale heaps, one more indignity for a piece of ground the whole township agreed was finished. But the old man's daughter stood at the fence with a mug of coffee, going to ice in her hand, and the question behind her eyes was not the one the drivers would have guessed. If the only thing wrong with this sawdust was that it was in the mill's way, why was the mill paying good money to make it disappear? Her name was Della Mercer, and she was 49 that autumn. The farm was 41 acres in the hardwood foothills of western North Carolina, and it had been her father's and his mother's before him. She had left at 20, married a man who moved her city to city for 30 years, and worked all that while as a laboratory technician, a careful, exact woman who had spent her life keeping things clean, labeling things right, and reading what a smear under a lens was truly telling her. When the marriage ended, quietly and with little fight left in either of them, the farm was the one thing she had to go back to. She came home to a leaking barn roof, a seized tractor, 2 seasons of back taxes, and the gentle, unanimous advice of nearly everyone she met: sell it and be done. Quick pause, right here near the start. If stories like this keep finding their way to you, this channel is probably worth sticking around for. Go ahead and subscribe. And do one small thing for me. Tell me where you're watching from tonight down in the comments. I read every single one. Now, back to the story. The advice was kind, and it was not exactly wrong. The extension agent had walked the place that spring and said out loud what everyone already believed. The ground was tired. The timber lot along the ridge had gone shaggy and past managing, and nobody made 40 acres pay anymore. Not against outfits like Caldwell with their kilns and their contracts. The bank said the same in colder words. Written off, that was the phrase living underneath all of it, the one nobody said to her face. The land was written off, and so, she understood plainly enough, was the 49-year-old divorced woman standing on it with lab-clean hands and no idea how to run a tractor. She had been home 7 months when the trucks came, and she had spent most of those months deciding whether the whole county was right about her. The morning after the third truck, before the sun had cleared the ridge, Della Mercer walked out to the heaps with a spiral notebook, a folding knife, and a small hand lens she had carried in a lab coat pocket for 20 years. She did not call the mill, and she did not call a lawyer. She remembered what her grandmother used to say every fall, that the woods were only ever waiting to eat the wood back. At the damp foot of last year's leftover pile, where the shavings had gone dark and soft with rain, she found them, a shelf of broad gray oyster mushrooms fanning out of the rotting wood in the cold. She turned one over with the knife, put the lens to the clean white gills, and a thing her grandmother had known and the mill did not care about arranged itself in her head. This was not garbage. It was substrate, tons of the exact thing half the forest floor is built to turn into food, dumped free at her fence line by people paying to be rid of it. Then the technician in her took over. One hardwood block of a few pounds, colonized and fruited, might throw better than a pound of mushrooms across its flushes. 3 mountains of sawdust was a number she did not try to finish. She underlined a figure in pounds, went inside, and called Caldwell Hardwoods, not to complain, to ask when the next load came, and to keep the pine out of it. What she learned that first winter she mostly learned the hard way, and the first lesson was that fresh is not the same as clean. Sawdust off the blades is not a blank slate. It is a feast every wild mold and yeast is racing to reach first, and the winners are never the ones you want. Her earliest trays, mixed on the kitchen counter, bloomed green and black long before any mushroom showed. She read everything she could find, ordered spawn from a supplier upstate, and taught herself the work. Hardwood sawdust cut with a little bran and gypsum, wetted to the dampness of a wrung sponge, packed into bags with a breathing filter patch, then steamed until nothing living was left, so the only thing she introduced afterward was the mushroom itself. It was slow, exacting, fussy work, and it was the first thing in 7 months that felt like something she already knew how to do. Then a woman from the county came out with the second lesson, what she could and could not sell, how it had to be labeled, and why no cultivated mushroom may be sold beside a wild-picked one. There were rules, permits, and a certified kitchen she did not yet have. The pity in town settled a little deeper. The man who could shorten her education by 2 years lived in a brick rancher on the far side of the county, his equipment rusting under tarps behind it. Emmett Ross had grown shiitake commercially on oak for better than 30 years until the cheap imports undercut him and he let it go. He was 74, deaf in one ear, and built like a man who had carried wet oak his whole life. Della drove out, laid it before him, and waited through a silence long enough to doubt herself twice. Then Emmett walked her out back, pulled a tarp off an old steam sterilizer and a still air inoculation cabinet, and sold her both for barely more than the scrap steel was worth, on the one condition that she not waste them. What came with them was worth more than the iron. Cook the substrate longer than you think you need to. Work clean, work still, and never open a bag where the air is moving. And when a block has colonized solid and white, and you want it to fruit, do not coax it, shock it, cold and wet and bright, the way a cold rain shocks the fall woods, and it will pin all at once. Her first real grow room nearly ended the whole thing. She had thrown it together fast in a back stall of the barn, hungry for scale before the season turned, and cut the corners a careful person should never cut, a fan pulling unfiltered air, bags open too near an open door, her clean habits worn thin by 14-hour days. What moved in was trichoderma, the green mold, the grower's oldest enemy, and it does not announce itself until it is already everywhere. It came up in one bag, then in 40, a spreading powdery green across blocks she had spent 6 weeks colonizing, and there was nothing to do but carry them all out. She burned better than 300 pounds of ruined blocks and stood by the barrel a long while, letting herself believe, for one evening, that everyone in town had been right about her. The next morning she stripped the room to the studs, sealed it, hung a filter over the intake, and made a rule as hard as any she had worked under: nothing goes into that room unless it is clean, no matter how far behind the season has fallen. She never lost a room again. The second failure changed the shape of the business, and like the first, it began as pure waste. After a block of sawdust throws its 2 or 3 flushes, what is left is called spent. A crumbling pail brick the trade treats as garbage, and she had hundreds. She dumped the first winter's worth in a low-shaded heap behind the barn, and a hard run of orders drove them out of her mind. When she came back to it in April, it had settled and darkened. And when she turned it with a fork, it fell open into the blackest, sweetest-smelling earth she had ever put her hands into, the mushroom's own slow work all winter, breaking the last of the wood down into something a garden would give anything for. She was half deciding to spread it and forget it when Emmett came by about a fitting on the sterilizer. He took a handful, worked it between his fingers, and said the 2 words worth more than the whole grow room: sell that. Good living compost was a thing gardeners and nurseries paid steadily for, more by weight than she had dreamed of getting. Her leftover had a second life, and she began building the piles on purpose. The mushrooms themselves had a quieter problem. At least the early ones, they came up watery and thin. The mill's loads ran to soft young poplar and fast-grown wood, ground fine and dumped fresh, and oyster mushrooms raised too quickly on too light a wood come up pale and limp in taste of next to nothing. Emmett named the trouble in 3 words over a coffee cup: no wood in them. The old growers wanted a dense, seasoned hardwood under a good mushroom: oak, hickory, the slow-grown stuff, for body and flavor, and the mill would never dump that because it sold its good oak by the boardfoot. But the ridge behind her house was full of it. The shaggy, past managing timber lot the extension agent had written off was standing oak and hickory, the deadfall beneath it seasoning itself for the taking, 100 steps from her door. She began cutting it, chipping it fine, folding it into the mill's soft, fresh sawdust, a third of the block, then nearly half, tasting the difference flush by flush. The farm everyone had written off was growing, along its written-off ridge, the one ingredient the mill would never give away. The second full season was the grind, and the grind was not the kind of thing that photographs. It was a walk-in cooler bought at auction, hauled home in pieces, and rebuilt against the barn wall to hold the cut mushrooms and slow their hurry to spoil. It was a fruiting room rigged with a humidifier, a timed fan, and a single bright bulb, because a mushroom needs damp, moving air and a little light to grow into anything you would want. It was a certified kitchen built at last into the old milk house, so she could legally dry and bag and sell. It was inoculating 500 bags on a Sunday with her hands moving in the still cabinet the way they had once moved over a lab bench. Through all of it, the trucks kept coming, and the town kept being gentle to her face. Then, one October afternoon, Emmett Ross stood in her fruiting room while a wall of oyster mushrooms grown on her own ridge oak blend came into their pens by the thousand, looked a long while, and nodded once. "That's a crop," he said. It was the highest praise the man owned, and she got no farther than the end of the lane before she had to stop the truck a minute. The market found her the way it finds anyone whose thing is real, a little at a time, then all at once by word of mouth. Saturdays she sold fresh oysters and shiitake, and before long, the shaggy white lion's mane the cooks went a little foolish over, off a folding table in town. One who stopped was a cook from a restaurant up in the resort country who bought everything on the table called Wednesday and asked for a standing order. Cooks talked to cooks. By spring, she was filling weekly cases for a produce distributor that ran to 4 counties of restaurants and a pair of small groceries, and drying the overflow for the shelf. The bagged compost went out through 2 garden centers who could not keep it in stock, and a run of little, grow-your-own kits she boxed up over the winter sold off the farm stand and through the mail faster than she could make them. One dumped pile of sawdust was feeding 4 separate things now: fresh mushrooms, dried, garden compost, and kits. And not one could have existed without the waste nobody else had wanted. By the fall of 2022, the third autumn, the trucks from Caldwell Hardwoods still turned up the gravel lane, but now they called first. The mill had worked out that its waste was worth something to somebody, and had quietly begun to protect the arrangement. Loads timed around her inoculating days, the pine kept out and the clean hardwood kept in, a spoken understanding that the sawdust came to the Mercer place first. 2 women from town worked alongside her through the busy months, glad of the wage. The barn wore a new steel roof, paid for outright. The bank had stopped calling about the taxes. Della Mercer never once said a number out loud, and this story is not going to say one for her. She was raised to believe you keep your money to yourself. But her accountant, closing the books that winter, gave her the plain shape of it. The farm the county had written off had just turned in its best year in 2 generations, and it was not a near thing. Cars still slowed on the county road. There was a farm stand sign at the end of the lane now, and on Saturday mornings there was a line. People ask her at the market what the trick was, and she gives them the lab technician's answer. She looked closely at a thing everyone else had already written down as nothing. The mill was not wrong that the sawdust was waste. It was waste to a business built to cut boards fast and get the leavings out of the way as cheaply as it could. The mill had asked the sawdust one question: how do we be rid of you? And never heard the only answer that mattered. She had walked out to the fence and asked it something else. What are you for? And the whole business, the bags and the sterilizer and the black spring compost and the ridge oak folded into the blocks, was nothing more than that one different question, asked patiently, for 3 years. Most opportunity does not arrive looking like opportunity. It arrives looking like a nuisance, a pile dumped at your fence line, a machine rusting under a tarp, a room gone green with mold, a piece of ground the whole county has agreed to stop believing in. It comes to you already labeled as waste, and it is labeled that way because somebody bigger and busier decided it was not worth their while, and their deciding is the whole reason it is lying there for you at all. The sawdust was never garbage. It was only ever in the wrong pile, waiting on someone who would ask what it was for instead of how to be rid of it. Somewhere near you right now there is almost certainly something written off. A field, a building, a skill, a person, waiting on somebody willing to walk out and look at it long enough to ask the question nobody else bothered with. What is this actually for? Sometimes the answer is nothing. And sometimes it is everything the people who dumped it could never see.